$12. That's all it cost. And the man standing in front of me, a 73-year-old farmer in the Rajasthan desert, where summer temperatures crack 50 degrees Celsius and rainfall is measured in centimeters per decade, hadn't paid a single water bill in 11 years. His tomatoes were 3 feet tall. His okra was flowering. His family's well, a narrow shaft cut into cracked sandstone a generation ago, had been dry since before his grandchildren were born. But the clay pots buried in his soil, those were full every single morning. I'm going to show you the engineering trick behind this. Not a trend, not a life hack, an actual technique that has sustained human agriculture for over 4,000 years, costs almost nothing to build, and delivers water directly to plant roots with a precision that modern drip irrigation systems, which cost hundreds or thousands of dollars per acre, genuinely cannot replicate. And the reason you've never heard of it, that part is worth understanding too. Stay with me, because the science behind why this works is going to surprise you. Let's talk about where your water actually goes. When you water a garden, whether by hand, hose, sprinkler, or even a standard drip line, somewhere between 40 and 70% of that water never reaches a plant root. It evaporates. It runs off. It pools at the surface and feeds the weeds instead of your crops. In arid climates, that number climbs higher. The USDA published research showing that surface irrigation in hot, dry conditions can waste up to 90% of applied water before it reaches root depth. 90%. You're paying for water, hauling water, stressing about water, and nearly all of it is disappearing into the air or the dirt before it does a single useful thing. Now think about what that means in a place like sub-Saharan Africa, or the American Southwest, or Indonesia's driest provinces, or the farming villages of northern India. Think about what it means for a family trying to grow food on a shrinking budget, with a well that goes lower every summer, in a world where municipal water costs are rising in nearly every major city. You've probably felt this yourself, the guilt of running a hose, the anxiety of a dry week, the frustration of watching a seedling wilt despite everything you did. You're not doing something wrong. The system itself is inefficient. It was designed around abundance, and abundance is disappearing. But here is what they never told you in any gardening course, any landscaping guide, any extension office pamphlet: there is a technology that delivers water at 100% efficiency to the root zone. No evaporation. No runoff. No surface wetting. The water moves directly from a porous clay vessel, buried underground, straight into the surrounding soil, pulled by the roots themselves, on demand, in exactly the quantity the plant needs. No timer. No pump. No electricity. No maintenance. Just physics and biology doing what they have always done, perfectly, without your intervention. This technology is called olia irrigation. The word comes from Spanish, it simply means pot, but the technique predates Spanish civilization by millennia. And the moment I understood how it actually worked, I stopped thinking of it as a gardening trick. I started thinking of it as one of the most elegant pieces of engineering ever devised by a human being. I'll tell you everything, the history, the science, the exact steps to build your own system for $12, but I need you to understand the backstory first, because it changes how you see everything that comes after. The earliest confirmed use of olia irrigation dates to roughly 2000 BCE in what is now northern China. The Gansu Corridor, a narrow strip of land connecting the Chinese heartland to Central Asia, is one of the harshest agricultural environments on Earth. Minimal rainfall. Brutal wind. Soil that turns to powder in summer and stone in winter. The people who farmed there couldn't afford to lose water to evaporation. They were literally betting their lives on every drop. So they developed a system, unglazed clay pots, sealed at the top, buried to the neck in the soil beside their crops, filled periodically with water. The pot sweated. Slowly, silently, the water passed through the microscopic pores of the fired clay and entered the soil directly at root level. This wasn't accidental. These farmers understood, empirically, through generations of observation, that the pots only released water when the soil around them was dry enough to pull it through. When the soil was already moist, the flow slowed or stopped. When roots pressed against the outside of the pot, the flow increased. The plant was essentially controlling its own irrigation. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual mechanism, and it has a name in modern soil science: suction-driven capillary flow. We'll get into the physics in a moment, but I want you to sit with the elegance of that first. A clay pot. A plant. And between them, a silent negotiation that has been happening in the dark, underground, for 4,000 years. The technique traveled. Along the Silk Road, Persian farmers adopted and refined it. In the Middle East, it appears in Arabic agricultural texts from the 9th century CE. Scholars like Ibn al-Awun described clay vessel irrigation in detail, noting which soil types and which crops responded best. In West Africa, particularly in what is now Niger and Burkina Faso, a related practice called zai used clay-bottomed planting pits to achieve a similar effect, concentrating water and organic matter at root depth in an environment that receives less than 400 millimeters of rain per year. And then, gradually, the knowledge faded. Not all at once. Not because of a single decision. The colonial agricultural systems imposed on much of Asia and Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries pushed large-scale monoculture and canal irrigation as markers of modern farming. Small-scale indigenous techniques were dismissed as primitive. When the Green Revolution arrived in the mid-20th century, bringing high-yield seeds, synthetic fertilizer, and mechanized irrigation, it brought with it an entire infrastructure of dependency. Pumps, pipes, chemicals, and power grids replaced the buried pot. The knowledge wasn't suppressed by a boardroom. It was crowded out by a business model. That's a quieter kind of erasure, but it's just as complete. Modern science has spent the last 30 years catching up. A study published in Agricultural Water Management in 2010 found that olia irrigation reduced water use by 33 to 70% compared to surface drip irrigation, while maintaining equivalent or superior crop yields. Research conducted in Iran, a country with a long historical relationship with clay vessel agriculture, found that buried clay pot systems increased tomato yields by up to 46% compared to furrow irrigation, while using 60% less water. The International Water Management Institute, based in Colombo, Sri Lanka, has studied olia-type systems across South Asia and Africa as a potential climate adaptation strategy for smallholder farmers. This isn't fringe research. It's peer-reviewed, replicated, and quietly building a case that the ancient world knew something we forgot. Stay with me, because in a few minutes I'm going to walk you through exactly how to build this for your garden, including the one mistake almost everyone makes with the lid that completely defeats the whole system. But first, you need to understand the mechanism. Because once you understand why it works, you'll never look at a clay pot the same way again. The science rests on two interlocking principles. The first is capillary action, the same force that pulls water up through a paper towel when you press it to a spill. At the microscopic level, water molecules are attracted to each other, that's called cohesion, and they're also attracted to surfaces, including the silica and aluminum oxide compounds in fired clay, that's adhesion. These two forces together create a tension in narrow spaces that literally pulls water in a direction that defies gravity. Think of the pores in unglazed clay like a network of microscopic straws, each one so narrow that the surface tension of the water creates a continuous column that can be pulled, slowly, in whatever direction the pressure gradient demands. When the soil surrounding a buried olia is dry, its own capillary tension is higher than the tension inside the pot. The soil is, in a sense, thirstier than the water. So the water moves outward, through the clay, toward the drier medium, following the gradient from high water potential inside the pot to low water potential in the surrounding soil. When the soil wets up, the gradient narrows. The flow slows. When it becomes saturated, the flow essentially stops. The system is self-regulating. Not electronically. Not mechanically. Thermodynamically, by the fundamental physics of water and energy. The second mechanism is root-induced suction, and this is the one that genuinely amazed me when I first read the research. Plant roots don't just sit there waiting for water to arrive. They actively generate suction, measured in units called megapascals, by maintaining an internal solute concentration that is lower than the surrounding soil water. This osmotic gradient pulls water from the soil into the root hair cells, which are the finest filaments of the root system, typically less than a millimeter in diameter. When those root hairs come into contact with the outer surface of an olia, or even grow toward it, drawn by the moisture gradient, they can extract water directly from the clay boundary layer at a rate that matches the plant's metabolic demand. This is why a healthy, established plant actually uses an olia more efficiently than a young seedling. The more vigorous the root system, the stronger the suction, the faster the water moves through the clay. The plant tells the pot how thirsty it is. The pot responds. No sensor, no programmer, no utility company required. And here's the detail that always stops people: in a well-installed olia system, the soil immediately adjacent to the pot never becomes waterlogged, because the suction is always pulling the water toward the roots before it can pool. You get none of the root rot, none of the anaerobic soil conditions that kill plants in overwatered gardens. The water is precisely placed, in precisely the right amount, at precisely the right time. Every time. Now here's the thing I didn't expect when I started researching this. The clay composition matters more than almost any guide will tell you. Unglazed terracotta, the standard red-brown clay pots you find at any nursery, works reasonably well, but its pore structure is relatively dense, which limits flow rate. Traditional ollas in Rajasthan and Gansu were made from a lower-fired, more porous clay, often mixed with sand or grog, which is crushed fired clay, that allowed a faster water transfer rate. Modern researchers have found that pots fired between 850 and 950 degrees Celsius maintain an optimal pore size for agricultural use, large enough to allow consistent water transfer, small enough to prevent soil particles from clogging the pores. The cheap terracotta pots from your hardware store were fired at 1000 to 1100 degrees, making them slightly too dense for peak performance. They still work, just more slowly. I'll tell you how to test your pots in the practical section. Have you ever tried burying a clay pot in your garden? Even accidentally, a broken pot left in the soil? If so, I want to know, did you notice anything different about the plants growing near it? Tell me in the comments, because I've heard some remarkable stories from people who stumbled onto this without realizing what they were doing. There is one more mechanism worth understanding, one that operates not through physics but through soil biology. As water slowly seeps from the olia into the surrounding soil, it creates a consistently moist zone that extends roughly 30 to 60 centimeters from the pot wall in all directions, depending on soil type and clay density. This zone doesn't fluctuate dramatically between wet and dry the way surface irrigated soil does. It stays in a narrow moisture band, what soil scientists call the field capacity range, for days or weeks at a time. Microbial life thrives in this zone. Bacteria, fungi, and particularly mycorrhizal networks, the fungal threads that colonize plant roots and extend their nutrient-gathering reach by up to 1000%, are catastrophically damaged by the boom-bust cycle of surface watering. Wet the soil, it floods. Let it dry out, it desiccates. The microbial community crashes and rebuilds, over and over, burning energy and nutrients in the process. An olia-irrigated zone maintains the stability that soil life requires to flourish. Within 2 to 3 months of installation, the soil surrounding an olia develops a biological richness that you can actually smell, that deep, earthy petrichor scent that indicates actinobacteria are active. That smell means your soil is alive. An alive soil feeds your plants in ways that water alone never can. Alright. Let's build this. What I'm about to describe is a system you can install in an afternoon for about $12 per olia, depending on where you source your materials. I've built these in raised beds, in-ground vegetable plots, and even large container gardens. The principles don't change. You need 2 standard terracotta pots of the same size. The ideal size for a home vegetable garden is a 6-inch or 8-inch pot, the kind that fits a tomato or geranium comfortably. For larger beds or fruit trees, you can go up to a 12-inch pot. For small herb gardens or containers, 4-inch pots work. You'll also need a piece of terracotta saucer, a small amount of waterproof adhesive, standard aquarium silicone works perfectly and is safe for edible gardens, and some fine gravel or coarse sand. Take the first pot. This is your body. Plug the drainage hole at the bottom using a piece of broken pottery or a flat stone sealed in place with a small bead of aquarium silicone. You want the hole completely sealed, this is non-negotiable, and I'll explain why in a moment. Take the second pot. You're going to use it only for its drainage hole, flip it upside down and seal it to the top of the first pot, rim to rim, using aquarium silicone around the entire circumference. What you now have is a sealed clay vessel with a single opening at the bottom of the inverted top pot. That inverted drainage hole becomes your fill port. It's small enough to reduce evaporation from the opening, but large enough to accept a hose or watering can. Seal the exterior joint completely. Run a bead of silicone around the joined rims and smooth it with a wet finger. Let it cure for 24 hours. Then do the submerge test, fill the assembled olia with water, hold it over a sink, and watch the outer surface. Within 5 to 10 minutes, you should see the surface darken with moisture as water begins to migrate through the clay. If water is running out the bottom, your bottom seal failed, redo it. If the surface stays completely dry after 20 minutes, your pot may be too densely fired. You can improve pour performance by soaking the assembled olia in water for 48 hours before installation, which reopens any pores that may have been partially sealed during firing. Now, dig your hole. Depth matters significantly here. Most people get this wrong because they bury the pot too shallow, which positions the water delivery zone at surface level rather than root level. For tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and squash, the heavy feeders, bury the olia so that approximately 80% of the pot is below the soil surface, with only the fill port and a few centimeters of the neck exposed. For root vegetables like carrots or beets, you actually don't want an olia directly in the row, place it between rows instead, because the moisture zone can cause forking in direct root crops. For herbs and leafy greens with shallower roots, 60% burial depth is sufficient. Before you set the olia in the hole, add a 2 cm layer of coarse sand at the base. This prevents fine soil particles from migrating against the pot wall and gradually clogging the pores, one of the 2 ways an olia system slowly fails over time if not protected. Place the olia into the hole. Backfill around it, tamping the soil lightly by hand, not with a tool, because you don't want to compact the soil immediately adjacent to the pot wall, which would restrict the capillary flow zone. The fill port should sit about 2 to 3 centimeters above the soil surface. Fill the olia with water. Just pour it in through the top until the pot is full. Then cover the fill port with a flat stone, a cork, or a fitted terracotta cap. Why? 2 reasons. First, standing water exposed to sunlight in a small cavity becomes a breeding site for mosquitoes within 4 to 7 days. Second, open water evaporates, even from a narrow port, at a rate that can account for 15 to 20% of your water loss. The stone or cap costs nothing and eliminates both problems. This is the lid mistake I mentioned earlier. It seems like a small detail. It is not a small detail. For a standard 8-inch olia in healthy loam soil, you'll need to refill it every 3 to 7 days during active summer growing season. Sandy soils drain faster, every 2 to 3 days. Heavy clay soils hold moisture longer, potentially 10 days between refills. You'll learn your soil's rhythm within the first 2 weeks. One advanced variation worth knowing: if you're in a rainfall variable climate, Indonesian dry season, for instance, or the American Southwest where monsoon rains can follow months of drought, you can connect multiple ollas via subsurface PVC pipe to a single gravity-fed header tank elevated about 1 meter above ground level. The tank maintains constant pressure, the ollas stay filled, and the entire system runs autonomously for weeks. The total cost for a Forolia system connected to a 40-liter header tank sits around $40 to $60. That's $40 to $60 for an irrigation system that can sustain a 20 square meter vegetable plot indefinitely, with zero electricity and crossed-out icons for power and tech. For those in tropical climates where the challenge isn't drought but inconsistent distribution, long wet periods followed by dry gaps, space your ollas at 40 to 60 centimeters apart. This distance creates overlapping moisture zones that effectively buffer plants through the dry gaps without overwatering during wet periods. In monsoon climates, you can simply stop filling the ollas during peak rain and let the soil moisture coast. The pots don't release water into already saturated soil, remember the physics, so you won't drown your plants even if you forget about the system for a week. Here's what happens after you install this system. In the first week, you'll see almost nothing. The soil around the olia darkens slightly in a ring. That's it. This bothers people. They assume something is wrong, that the pot isn't working, that they sealed it too well. They're not wrong to be cautious, but what they're seeing is normal. The capillary zone is establishing itself, the water is moving through the soil matrix, following the path of least resistance toward the dry zones between soil particles. The roots haven't found the olia yet. Give it time. By the end of week 2, something changes. The plants closest to the olia, within 30 centimeters, begin to show a subtle difference in color saturation. The leaves deepen. The stems thicken slightly. This is the mycorrhizal network beginning to stabilize. The root system is actively growing toward the moisture gradient. If you were to dig carefully near the olia at this point, which I don't recommend, but which has been done in research settings, you'd find the finest root hairs beginning to press against the outer clay surface. Some of them penetrate partially into the pore channels. This is not damage. This is the system working exactly as designed. By month 2, the transformation is visible without digging. Plants irrigated by olia consistently grow with a more upright, vigorous structure than the same plants surface irrigated nearby. Fruiting crops set more fruit. Leafy crops show less tip burn and yellowing. The soil between waterings, that stretch of 5 to 7 days, no longer shows the stress cracks and powder-dry surface you associate with an unirrigated bed. The stable moisture zone has changed the microclimate at soil level. Temperature fluctuations between day and night moderate. Beneficial insects, ground beetles, predatory mites, colonize the stable zone because it provides habitat consistency they can't find in boom-bust irrigated beds. There will be a moment, maybe 3 weeks in, maybe 4, where you go to water and realize you forgot for 5 days. And the plants are fine. Better than fine. This is not a small moment. This is the point where the emotional reality of the system lands, where the anxiety loop of daily watering, the guilt of forgetting, the scramble during a busy week, simply dissolves. You've handed the negotiation back to the plant and the soil, and they're handling it without you. This is what the $12 actually buys you. Not a pot. Not a gadget. A relationship between your garden and its water that existed before modern agriculture decided plants needed to be managed, metered, and dependent on infrastructure that someone else controls. The ancient farmer in Gansu who buried the first olia wasn't primitive. She was solving a harder problem than most modern irrigation engineers ever face, with fewer resources, and she solved it in a way that is still functionally superior 4,000 years later. The knowledge was always there. It's been sitting in archaeological records, in ethnobotanical surveys, in agricultural journals that most gardeners never read. It was crowded out, not deleted. And that means it's recoverable. It means that you, with $12 and an afternoon, can step outside the water bill, outside the infrastructure, outside the system that tells you gardening requires expensive inputs and professional knowledge and a running tap. You can grow food the way humans grew food before they were taught to be customers. Share this with someone who told you their garden was too dry, or their water costs were too high, or that growing food in their climate wasn't realistic. Because I've been hearing that for years, and I'm tired of it being treated as a fact when it's actually just a failure of memory. Subscribe if you want to keep digging into what's been buried. Next week, I'm going to show you a soil amendment that was used across 3 continents for 2,000 years, disappeared almost completely in the 20th century, and was quietly rediscovered in the Amazon basin, one that permanently changes the structure of your soil in ways that no fertilizer can replicate. You're going to want to see that one. The $12 pot in the ground knows what your plants need. Maybe it's time you let it do its job.